I appreciate the invitation to be here. Last time I spoke here, I think, was 15 years ago. Brother Ken Burleson was the director at that time, doing a good job with the school. And Guyton was actually a student here at that time. And I'm very proud of Guyton, all joking aside about the subject, and he did assign me a very difficult subject. But I am very proud of Guyton and the work that he has done here, and not just him, but the work that he has carried on that Brother Burleson and Brother Brantley and Brother Orr and others started over at the old Inslee building. That's where when I spoke last time, that's where I spoke. And it's good to see this congregation still thriving and the work of training young preachers still going on today. And we appreciate all that they do. It's already been stated by Guyton and by Brother Cox, Wayne Cox, and I'm sure Rick knows it's going to be here in just a little bit that there's going to be some overlap. Matter of fact, there's going to be overlap that's going to go all the way back to yesterday's lesson just a little bit in the introduction. I thought about this more recently, and I don't know why I didn't think about it earlier, but Wayne Cox and Rick Knowles and I should have got together about 6 months ago and put our heads together and put this series together as a joint effort. And it had been a whole lot easier. But when Guyton told me my subject, I at first was excited because I am a history buff. Brother Cox mentioned Shiloh, and I don't know how many times I've been through the battleground at Shiloh, just stood and looked at the bloody pond many times and walked those hillsides. And I love to study history, and so whenever I thought Jewish history, that's an area of history that I never studied before. So that's going to be a great study. So I got online and I went to Freed Hardeman's library. I think I found out the same thing that Ray Pack found out when he went in Freed Hardeman's library. He said, well, we have no idea what you're wanting. I searched for the period of time online and could not find information online. I even had Guyton and Larry searching around at various libraries and all helping me find information. So finally I got the bright idea. There's a synagogue at Knoxville. If anybody knows Jewish history, it's got to be those that teach that regularly. So I called the Jewish synagogue at Knoxville and I told them, I said, I'm Tim Hester, I'm from Crossville, Tennessee, and I'm doing a lecture come February on the history of Judaism in the 5th to 9th century. And I was wondering if you could help me with it. First thing the lady that answered the phone said, well, why in the world did they get you to do it? That's serious. And my answer to her was, I've been asking myself the same thing. She said, well, there is a lady here that is the former chair of the Jewish religious at the University of Tennessee. Said, I will email her. Well, she emailed her, and I got a response back that that's the period that's called the Dark Ages. I did learn some things. There was one book that they did refer me to, and after much searching, I was able to find the book, and I think I found out the Guyton's got it in his library. But other than that, there is not very much. And this lady that is from the University of Tennessee, she did tell me, she said there are other things that are written that really they're not reliable sources that you could go to. She said there's really not that much that you can find that's written during that time. But I did get my hands on the recommended reading that she had suggested to me. And there's one thing that I noticed as I started reading about this period of time is that you cannot start in the year 400. That you have to go back all the way back to 33 AD. Because that is where the true history of this period begins. Another thing that I learned from the lady from UT was, in searching for Jewish history during this time, don't look for 400 to 800 AD, look for 400 to 800 CE. I had to look up see what CE stood for instead of what we would refer to as AD. It's the Common Era. They refer to anything before what we would consider 1 AD as BCE, which we would call before Christ. They call it before Common Era. So that kind of helped my searching just a little bit, knowing to look for the right terms. But I learned that in searching that I had to go back to AD 33. And of course, we're all familiar with what happened in AD 33. That's when the establishment of the church upon the day of Pentecost. That is really the whole central point that framed even Judaism today. Because it was the establishment of the church on the day of Pentecost that began to change everything, and would 400 years later would have a great effect upon Judaism and the world altogether. Now, there's one thing to keep in mind, that as we go through this, that we're not only going to be looking at Judaism, we're going to have to be touching upon some other things also. Now, I know there are others, as there's already been at least a couple of lectures on the period of time before mine. Brother Cox did a great job, and I really enjoyed his lecture. I think I enjoyed it more knowing that I had the following period of time. And I'm really looking forward to Brother Rick Knowles and the next period of time. But we also have lectures. There's someone that's speaking on Catholicism. There's someone that's speaking on Constantinople, I believe. There's someone that's speaking on Mormonism. But in order for us to cover Judaism during this time, we're going to have to touch on each and every one of them, because all these things had their influence on the Jews during this 400-year period of time. Which, I noticed you only had 200 years to cover, and I had 400 years to cover. So, looking at Judaism during this time, the establishment of the church, as we've already stated, was the central thing that affects Judaism. The next central thing that affects Judaism also happened in the first century, and that is the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. Because both of these events widely affected Judaism. The established church began to see the decline of the influence of the Jews as both a religious and a political power. Now, you stop and think about the power that Judaism wielded within the Roman government even. The fact that they were even able to get Rome to arrest and crucify Christ for them showed the type of power. And although there was a subservient system at that time, they still had the influence within that. But as we see the establishment of the church, we see Christianity grow, we see that influence decreases. But then we also see that with the fall of Jerusalem, a wider chasm is made. And all this is going to influence everything. And I told God, and I wouldn't use up my whole time, but I'm going to have to start moving on if I'm going to get through in time for us to eat lunch. But all this saw many Jews and non-Jews converting to Judaism. We're all familiar in Acts the 17th chapter, and this is the only passage out of the Bible that we will use probably during this whole lecture. But Acts the 17th chapter and verse 4, that Paul and his company were accused of turning the world upside down. By AD 33, approximately one-third of the Roman Empire had converted to Christianity. Now you think about it, wouldn't it be great if we could say that about the United States today? That one-third of the United States had converted to Christianity? About 130 AD, that is nearly 70 years, that's 60 years after the fall of Jerusalem. So we see there the influence that Christianity had in shaping the history of Judaism. And then we find in the 4th century Catholicism coming along. And we're not going to deal much with Catholicism except for we're going to mention the fact that Catholicism influenced upon the Roman government. That they, throughout history, and there was ups and downs between Catholicism and the Roman government. But not just the ups and downs of Catholicism's influence upon the Roman government, but also the influence that Catholicism had upon the world at that time. It shaped the thinking of many leaders throughout the world. So when you see in the 4th century AD Catholicism that's coming on, you see in the 1st century AD how that Christianity turned the world upside down. And now we come to just before the 5th century, Palestine comes under Byzantine rule. Byzantine rule is a rule of the Eastern Roman Empire. This is what was at Constantinople. And this is really what brings us to our period of time now, that the area that most of the Jews are under the Byzantine rule. The Byzantine rule was so harsh that that term is even still used today. It's used concerning governments that have a bureaucratic system that does not allow certain groups to advance. And the Byzantine rule was purposely set up to keep the Jews from advancing. The Jews were set under laws. So one of the laws was the Jews were not allowed under law to marry anyone who was a Christian. Now, we go back to what we're saying, that AD 33, AD 70, the establishment of the Catholic Church in the 300s, all this influenced all these laws that are being made under the Byzantine rule. They're forbidden by law to hold public office. Now, if we go back to the New Testament, we can see how the Jews commonly held public office during that time. So within 300 years, 400 years or so, Jews are no longer allowed to hold public office. It's made it illegal for them to build new synagogues during this time. They were stripped of the right to own Christian slaves, limiting their ability to compete with Christians who were allowed to own Jewish slaves. Their livelihood was gradually being stripped away from them. Jews during this period of time, at the start of the 5th century, were being made to, I don't even know if I would term them as second-class citizens. They were maybe more closer to third- and fourth-class citizens in the biggest parts of the world. In AD 49, the Patriarch, the last vestige of Jewish autonomy, was abolished. They were no longer to practice this, but had to conform to what the Byzantine government said that they could and could not do. Justinian, who ruled in AD 527 to 565, dictated conduct in the synagogue, including that rabbinic interpretation of Scripture was to be prohibited. Now think about it this way. Think about if our government, and I pray that it never happens, but I'm just using this as an example. Think about if our government stood up today and said that we could not preach the gospel of Jesus Christ from their pulpits. Think about if they stood up and said that we cannot teach the gospel of Jesus Christ in classrooms, that we cannot have gatherings like what we're having right now. That is exactly what the Jews were facing. They were told, you can no longer teach your doctrine. You can no longer preach that. During this time, some attempted to outlaw Judaism altogether. Under Spain's King Sisbet, who ruled from 612 to 621, Jews were given the choice of either converting to Christianity, being exiled, or being put to death. Again, the history here that just keeps over and over repeating itself. If we talk about somebody that wanted to commit mass execution of Jews from history, most of us would think about Hitler, would we not? And the death counts during World War II and just previously to World War II. Hitler was just one in a line of those that tried to exterminate the Jews over time, beginning with the 5th century A.D. That they wanted to imprison, they wanted to exile, and they wanted to put to death those that practiced Judaism. St. Augustine in 354 to 430 A.D. advocated the Jews should not be utterly destroyed, but instead should survive in a state of poverty and social exclusion. In other words, let's not kill them, let's just put them in a place that they would wish they were dead. We'll keep them poor and we'll keep them off over to the side. We won't have anything to do with them. Is that not the way that we find that governments often control their people? And by exiling them? Pope Gregory I, and again, remember I mentioned how it's hard when you're studying this to separate the Catholics from these governments. Catholicism had such an influence over these rulers during this time. And Pope Gregory I ruled in AD 590 to 604, as well as the succeeding popes throughout the Middle Ages, adopted the policy which was forwarded by Augustine. So we see that the Catholic Church wanted to suppress the Jews. They wanted to knock them down a notch, I reckon you might say. At the beginning of the 7th century, in 603, the Jews began to see some hope for some relief from the oppression which they were suffering. It was during this time that the Persian king, and I'm going to pronounce this the best way I can because I could not find a pronunciation for it. It's Chosroes. Chosroes is how I pronounce it. That's correct? Okay. King Chosroes II began his attack on the eastern provinces of Rome. Now, the Jews looked very favorably upon Chosroes and the Persians because here it is, they thought, this is our hope. We have a man that he's wanting to conquer Rome that is going to look favorable upon us, so we need to look favorable upon him. In 614, with the help of the Jews, King Chosroes was able to conquer Jerusalem. He killed and deported large numbers of Christians. Upon his conquering of Jerusalem, King Chosroes, at this point, puts the Jews back in control of Jerusalem. He handed the city back over to them. Now, it had probably been 400 or 500 years since they really had any control under Jerusalem. Here was their city. And even still today, Jerusalem is being fought over by the Jews and others, is it not? The city of Jerusalem is divided by this group and that group and that group. So the Jews now had their city back. They had Jerusalem back in their hands. That lasted for 12 years. In 629, Roman Emperor Heraclius conquered the city once more. He ripped the city away from the Jews and turned it back over to Byzantine rule. For 12 years, the Jews held that position that they had held up until AD 70. Over the course of time, from the fall of Jerusalem to the 5th century, the academic epicenter of Judaism moved from Jerusalem to Babylonia. The rabbinical scholars moved to Babylon. There was a great influx of them at this time. They came to the establishment of a Jewish commentary known as the Babylonian Talmud. There's two things that, back several years ago, I had an opportunity at the Jewish temple in Jasper, Alabama. Jewish temple was right across from the 6th Avenue church building. And they were offering Hebrew courses free of charge. And who couldn't, I lived right across the street from them just about, who couldn't take them up on that? And the last night of our class, they brought out the Talmud and the Torah to let us see it. We couldn't touch it, but we could see it. They still hold in very high regard, especially their rabbis, hold in very high regard the Talmud. The Talmud would become their book. It would become, Brother Cox mentioned, they called it their commentary. And as he said, like commentaries, we today think of a commentary as being something that we look to for comments, somebody's opinion. They look to it for actual rule. In AD 622, or in AD 499, the Babylon Talmud was completed. The Talmud was written in Aramaic in an area that is now known as Iraq. Now, we think of Iraq, we don't think about Judaism, do we? We think about Iraq today, we think of Muslims, Islam. But during this time, that area was occupied, not just occupied, it was a center part of the Jewish religion. It was occupied by Jews. And the town became the central authoritative source for the Jews. Rabbis had taken on not only a role as religious leaders, but also serving as judges in civil and social issues. This is a practice that started during this time there in what is modern-day Iraq, that is still carried out in many Jewish communities today in the United States will still turn to the rabbis to settle their disagreements. Instead of going to court like many people would do, they allow the rabbi to settle it for them. Many countries, the rabbi would even allow for divorcement. I think under Jewish law, they're supposed to here in the United States, but still has to go through civil government. But a lot of areas, the rabbi makes the final decision on divorces. And that started during this time with the influx of the Jewish rabbis to this area and the writing of the Talmud. But then in the early to mid-7th century, both the Jewish and the non-Jewish world will be changed. Something happens during this time that still affects us each and every day today. And that is Muhammad comes on the scene. In 622, Muhammad moved himself and his followers to Medina, where they would establish a community upon the teachings of Muhammad known as Islam. The influence that Muhammad wanted to have over not just Judaism, but have over Christianity in this part of the world. It's going to shake the world even today. We still feel the aftershocks today of what took place back in 600s. By the mid-8th century, Muhammad's followers had stretched out from their small community at Medina. They seized Palestine and Egypt from the Byzantine Empire, reducing it to the Balkans, Asia Minor, and parts of southern Italy. The Byzantine Empire had held this land for about 300, 400 years with very little interruption. And now Muhammad's followers have come along and they have kicked the empire out. They are now the new ruling class within this area. The Jews, though, are elated over it. Although their teaching along with the Islamic teaching does not agree, but they are glad to see that somebody is kicking the Byzantines out, because they were so oppressed. And by 1200, they seize Iraq and Persia from the 1,200-year-old Persian Empire. The Islamic Empire stretched from the Indus River to the east, the Atlantic Ocean in the west. Now somebody said, but there's still oppressed. And yes, they were still oppressed. Christians were still oppressed at that time. Matter of fact, Christians had become to be oppressed at that time. But think about it this way. You are in pain. You have a shooting pain that goes through your leg. And you cannot hardly stand that pain. The doctor gives you something to make that from a shooting pain to a dull pain. It makes you feel better, does it not? Because now with that dull pain, you can get up and walk where before you couldn't. That's the way the Jews felt. They were so oppressed by the quote-unquote Christians and the Catholics and the Byzantines that even though they still suffered under Islam, they were given more freedom. The Pact of Omar was put in place by the Muslims because the Muslims did not look upon the Jews and the Christians in the same way that the Byzantines did. They looked upon the Jews and the Christians as somebody that needed protecting. The Byzantines looked on them as somebody that needed to be wiped off the face of the earth. But the Muslims thought, we need to protect them. We need to take care of them. We need to nourish them. As I read this, I kind of thought of it at times as like a mother with a child. They kind of looked upon the Jews and the Christians as their children that they need to watch over. Well, you know, if you got a child, you want to make some rules for that child, do you not? To take care of them. So that's the way they were treated. They were treated as children with these rules. And these rules was called the Pact of Umar. Again, I could not find a pronunciation for that. I just pronounce it the way I read it. Under the Pact of Umar, Christians and Jews could practice their respective religious practices. Now remember, under the Byzantines, the Jews could not teach and practice their religion. But now they can. They could retain their property with understanding that they would abide by certain rules. First of all, they would pay special taxes. Second, they would build no new nor repair old churches or synagogues. Now, that's kind of, but you can have it, you just can't keep it up. If it starts falling in, then it's gone. They would hold no public religious service nor try to convert others. They're not permitted to strike a Muslim. They're not permitted to carry a weapon. They're not permitted to ride a horse. And they were permitted to wear recognizable clothing. Again, let's move this up to the 20th century. These rules that we have here, do not look like the same things that Hitler imposed against the Jews? These are things that repeated itself throughout the centuries. Fortunately for the Jews, the Muslims did not always adhere to the Pact of Umar. They weren't very strict on them. And because of that, they allowed the Jews to prosper. In AD 750, Abbasid dynasty had taken control of Palestine, making Baghdad its capital in AD 762. In doing so, the Abbasid dynasty revoked the prohibition which had been put in place by the Byzantine Empire prohibiting the Jews from inhabiting the city. They were now allowed to go back into Baghdad. They were kicked out of Jerusalem and they were kicked out of Baghdad, but now they are allowed back into the city. Baghdad becomes a world metropolis, causing the Jewish community in Iraq to prosper. Under Islamic rule, the Jews would once again reclaim their semi-autonomous rule that they enjoyed in previous years under the Persian Empire. The Muslims would now recognize the Exarch as the leader of the Jews. Now, the Exarch claimed to be a descendant of Jehoiakim, the king of Judah. And because of that, he thought that he was the rightful leader of the Jews, that he's the one that should be their leader. And the Muslims agreed with him. The Muslims and the Jews both treated the Exarch as royalty. And although they were still subjects of another group of people, the Jews would prosper religiously, economically, and socially. With the economic boom brought to the area of Iraq by the Muslims, the Jews by the 9th century had in the most part removed from being farmers to being merchants and craftsmen within the cities. That is still common today, that Jews today are known for a lot of their craftsmanship and their business dealings, which has started here in Baghdad. And although the Exarch was permitted to appoint judges, for the most part, the rabbis still acted as the judges. In most cities, the Jews still turned to the rabbis for the decisions when they had these civil and these criminal things to come up, and they still turned to the Talmud for the answers. But probably one of the biggest things that would influence from this period of time on is the fact that they were allowed to establish schools. These schools chiefly taught religious law. They taught the Talmud, essentially. But those that went through the schools learned Judaism, and it was taught from one generation to the next from there. This is the first schools really for a long time that we find within Judaism. A lot of this dealt with more than just Judaism as a religion. During this time span, the Jews suffered so much on a social and economic level. But you know, their life was tied to social and economic life. And social economic life influences religious life, even in our world today, regardless of what religion it is. So when we look, that is the dark ages of Judaism. I hope that you've been able to understand. I told God I wouldn't film my whole time. I pretty well filled it. But I do hope that I was able to assist you. And if you get a chance, it takes a lot of study, but if you get a chance, it is an interesting study to dig down and study some of this more in detail. Thank you.